The East Sea, or South China Sea as internationally referred, has for decades now become a regional hotspot due to China's territorial ambition and aggression. By military force, China occupied the paracels from Vietnam in 1974, took a number of coral reefs under Vietnam's control in the Spratlys in 1988, and seized the Mischief Reef from the Philippines in 1995. In recent years, China has taken increasingly assertive steps to promote a 9-U-shaped line claiming over 85% of the East Sea. This line was inadvertently drawn in 1947 by some Chinese office clerk in the Chiang Kai-shek administration without coordinate specification or legal basis. As of late, China has taken aggressive steps to force this claim and implement its sea power strategy, such as harassing Vietnam's research and exploration vessels, forcibly occupying the Scarborough, imposing fishing bans, seizing Vietnamese fishermen, offering several oil and gas blocks in Vietnamese waters for international bidding. In a most outrageous move, China placed its giant oil rig Haiyang Shiyou 981 deep in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone in continental shelf on May 2, 2014. This wrongful act by China has so far escalated tension and posed a serious threat to peace, maritime security, and freedom of navigation in the Southeast Asian region and in the East Sea. China's oil rig Haiyang Shiyou 981 was operating some 80 nautical miles into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone and 119 nautical miles from Vietnam's baseline, surrounded by a safety perimeter of 1 mile in radius, which was later expanded to 3 miles and up to 10 miles at times. On May 27th, the oil rig was moved 23 nautical miles from its initial location, but remained well within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. The oil rig has been protected by a number of vessels and aircraft, which numbered over 130, including military ships. The Chinese vessels have repeatedly used high-power water cannons and ramming tactics to block Vietnamese law enforcement vessels approaching the illegally positioned oil rig, causing serious damages to the Vietnamese vessels and injuries to a number of officers on board. China's brazen, belligerent acts have clearly violated Vietnam's sovereignty and international laws. Firstly, the Chinese oil rig is positioned entirely inside Vietnam's exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, encroaching upon Vietnam's sovereign rights and jurisdiction in accordance with Article 57 of the 1982 United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which stipulates the exclusive economic zone shall not extend beyond 200 nautical miles from the baselines from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured.
Well, this is pretty simple. The Chinese towed a billion-dollar oil rig about 130 miles off of Vietnam's coast, and they've started to drill. Now, this is clearly within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. And what's important is that China actually ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which makes it pretty clear that this is Vietnamese waters.
China has made repeated attempts to mislead the international community, arguing that its oil rig is positioned within the contiguous zone of the so-called Chung Chien Islet in the Xisha archipelago. What China claimed was in fact the Chi Don Islet at the western end of the Paracel archipelago belonging to Vietnam. China, therefore, has no basis for this argument. Vietnam has sufficient historical and legal evidence to prove its sovereignty. Vietnam was the first to occupy and exercise sovereignty over the uninhabited Paracel archipelago. Vietnam possesses geographical records to support and confirm Vietnam's occupation and establishment of sovereignty over the Paracel archipelago. In addition, there are existing Western and Chinese records of these activities by successive feudal dynasties of Vietnam on this territory. In 1974, the Chinese Navy attacked and seized the Paracels from the then American-backed Republic of Vietnam. Secondly, China's move was in violation of the Declaration of Conduct of the Parties in the South China Sea, or DOC, signed by all ASEAN member countries and China itself in 2002. DOC commits all parties to respect the freedom of navigation in and above the East Sea, to exercise self-restraint in the conduct of activities to avoid escalation of tension or further complication of disputes that could undermine regional stability and peace. China's acts have obviously run counter to the terms and spirit of the multilaterally agreed DOC.
China's act is a serious setback for own efforts to reduce tensions in the South China Sea and to implement the DOC cited by China and ASEAN.
China is a very strong, important partner to ASEAN, but it must actually deliver on the commitments, on the Declaration of Conduct that we have all signed on board on.
Thirdly, China's act was in violation of international principles and practices in settling international disputes without the threat or use of force. China has resorted to aggressive and intimidating tactics, such as ramming or cannon-watering law enforcement vessels as well as Vietnamese fishing boats. They upped the ante by deploying destroyers and aircraft for on-site backup. These acts by China is against Article 2 of the UN Charter, that is, to settle international disputes by peaceful means and refrain from the threat or use of force.
This is a major escalation because of the numbers of ships and because military ships are involved, which is not usually the case with China.
In spite of China's unilateral and provocative acts, Vietnam has exercised utmost self-restraint, repeatedly initiated diplomatic communication to Chinese authorities at different levels to protest and demand immediate withdrawal of China's oil rig from Vietnam's waters. Vietnam has also strongly committed to peaceful means to resolve the issue and ruled out the possibility of taking any unilateral military action. However, Vietnam reaffirmed its determination to resolutely defend its territorial sovereignty and legitimate interests in accordance with international laws.
Vietnam vehemently denounced acts of infringements and will resolutely protect our national sovereignty and legitimate interests in conformity with international law. Struggling for country's sovereignty by own measures and persistently maintaining peaceful and stable environment for the country's development.
China's unilateral and illegal acts of provocation in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone have caused stern condemnations from Vietnamese at home and abroad. In the last ASEAN summit in Myanmar, ASEAN foreign ministers issued a joint statement affirming their concerns over the placement of China's oil rig.
We're deeply concerned by the tension in the East and South China Sea. We oppose any unilateral attempt by any party to assert its territorial or maritime claims through the use of intimidation, coercion, or force. We regard the latest case as being part of a series of unilateral and provocative maritime advancement activities by China. Japan would offer its utmost support for efforts by ASEAN member countries to ensure the security of the seas and the skies, and rigorously maintain freedom of navigation and overflight.
All nations that are engaged in navigation and traffic within the South China Sea, East China Sea, deeply concerned about this aggressive act.
Nous sommes préoccupés par les récents incidents.
We are concerned about the recent incident between China and Vietnam regarding China's oil rig placement in the South China Sea. We are worried that unilateral activities will undermine regional security environment.
International media and scholars have also voiced the views that China's move is causing concerns in many countries around the world.
If you mention the entire South China Sea and the 9 dash line, there is very little legal basis for it, and the Chinese themselves have great difficulty trying to justify it.
That if you ask an independent legal expert, does China have a right to put the oil rig into the EEZ of Vietnam, they'd say no.
The 13th Shangri-La Dialogue became a forum for the international community to express concerns and criticism of China's acts in the East Sea.
Why don't China clarify your 9-line claim to the South China Sea according to UNCLOS principles and try to finalize the code of conduct as soon as possible, perhaps before the end of the year? Thank you.
So I just fail to understand, after ratifying the UNCLOS, how is it you've drawn a line over the water?
So China only responds to provocations. Can you tell us what provocation Vietnam made near the Paracels to force you to bring the CNOOC oil rig there at the early?
China's placement of the Haiyang Shiyou 981 oil rig deep inside Vietnam's exclusive economic zone is in fact a further step to implement its maritime strategy, forcing its 9-line claim over 85% of the East Sea.
It is a supplementary element in Chinese global actions to seize the East Sea by the 9-line. In my opinion, the aim of China is to implement its strategies of strengthening China's influence in the South China Sea with the Paracel archipelago as centrality.
China's latest step is an escalation after a series of provocative actions in the East Sea, including increased military presence in the East Sea, continuous harassment of Vietnamese fishermen, reclaiming and upgrading infrastructures at some coral reefs seized by force from Vietnam in the Spratly archipelagos, blocking the Philippine supply vessels to the second Thomas Shoal. China's move has become a test for Vietnam, ASEAN countries, and the international community. If China could get away with this in Vietnam's waters, it would be more willing to move the oil rig around within its 9-line.
China's move has been calculated to test reaction from other parties in the region. Strong and resolute oppositions could make China think twice and change course. But timid response would lead to escalations by emboldened China.
Despite protests and condemnations from Vietnam and the international community, China has maintained its oil rig and hundreds of law enforcement vessels and military ships in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. China's acts not only violate Vietnam's sovereign rights, but also seriously threaten peace and stability in the region. China must immediately remove its oil rig and all its ships, vessels, and personnel from Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, compensate for all the damages to Vietnamese personnel and vessels, and ensure that such acts will never recur. Being a powerful country and a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China must behave responsibly to respect international law and legitimate interests of smaller countries. China should be a constructive member of the world.